Welcome back with another Redwall review. Today we're talking about a book that is very dear to my heart, and that book is Martin the Warrior. This is the first Redwall book I ever read. It's the sixth Redwall book that Brian Jacques ever wrote, but if you're reading in what's called the chronological order, there's an argument you should read this one first. Firstly, because for a long time it was the first chronological book, and even though you could argue it's always dumb to read in chronological order, I feel like it's really random to read the one book Brian Jacques later wrote that takes place before the time of Martin first, Lord Brocktree, because that's just a completely random place to start the series. Whereas this could be an introduction to the world of Redwall, because Martin is like the one character who's in pretty much every Redwall book, in a few as this living, breathing warrior, and in many as this ghost who inspires all the future warriors of Redwall. But what specifically is going on in this book? Well, a recurring theme in discussing the series is, of course, there's so many of these books, and in a way, they're all kind of similar, same subject matter, good versus evil battles between British woodland creatures. But one way to think about that repetitiveness is to look at Brian Jacques' writing process. When I read the fourth book, Mariel of Redwall, I kind of interpreted it as a loose rewrite of the first book. It felt like it had a similar main character, but Brian Jacques had just sort of worked out the kinks of the universe a bit more and was writing a higher quality version of that first story. This book feels like a rewrite of Mossflower, which is funny because, again, as a kid, when I was reading these books in chronological order, thinking that was the one order, I thought that Mossflower was the sequel to Martin the Warrior. Whereas, in fact, Mossflower is the second book Brian Jacques ever wrote, and at the time, he meant that to be the story of Martin. And then a few years later, 1993, year of my birth, it so happens, he decides, you know what, I want to write a story of Martin that predates the events of Mossflower. So beyond that, both Mossflower and Martin the Warrior have a structural thing in common. They exist before the time of Redwall Abbey. What Redwall Abbey allows to happen in these books is it allows for at least some of the book to happen in peacetime. Sometimes you'll have a whole plot of the book that's centered around peacetime. Sometimes it's a few short moments. But before the stronghold of Redwall Abbey, where all the creatures live together in peace, it feels like these tyrannical vermin characters have a lot more power. So it's the Green Eyes family in Mossflower, and in this world, it's the tyrannical Stoat, Badrang, who is building a fortress called Marshank, and he has all these slaves. And one of his slaves is the young mouse who goes on to be our hero, Martin the Warrior. So I've said this book is really special to me. Unlike the other books I've talked about so far, which I was reading for a second time, this one I am reading for a third time because it was special to me. I think I last reread it when I was about 21 years old. And I feel like I've had a slightly different reaction to the book each time. So the first time I read it as a little kid, it was my first time adjusting to this kind of books. The prose were a bit difficult for me at the time, so I missed out on some of the details. I remember I sent this embarrassing email to Brian Jacques asking why the character of Tabar changed into the character of Bala, whereas if I would have had better reading comprehension, I would have realized that Tabar was just an alias Bala briefly adopts during a comical scene. But anyway, I read it as an 8-year-old. I read it as a 21-year-old, and at the time I was in college. I was in a more political phase of my life. And I really interpreted this as a political book at the time. So, previously it felt like Redwall books were strictly about like mythical notions of good and evil. And yes, they have the concept of slavery in them, but slavery was just a bad thing that bad people could do. In this book, slavery is right at the center, and it feels like it has a political connotation, maybe even some allegory to the American struggle for freedom from slavery and subsequent civil rights struggles, because this book centers around various characters and the ways they deal with slavery. So at the beginning of this book, we are introduced to our 5 main characters. We have Martin, this young mouse who's given a sword from his father when his father goes off on a mission, and then shortly thereafter is kidnapped into slavery. We have Brome, an even younger mouse who's out adventuring and ends up getting caught by the slavers. We have Rose, who is Brome's older sister and is sent out to find him and ends up meeting Martin along the way. We have Grum, who is Rose's best friend and traveling companion and likes to make soup, but because he's a mole, he pronounces it zoop. And we have Feldo, who's a squirrel. He's about Martin's age, but he's been enslaved far longer than Martin or Brome. So he has this real anger towards slavery. And the book basically opens with these 5 characters coming together. They escape from the evil Stoat Badrang's fortress at sea, but then they get separated. So ironically, Rose has traveled all this way to rescue her brother Brome, but suddenly Rose, Martin, and Grum are in one group, and Feldo and Brome are at another. And Feldo and Brome stay by the fortress and end up building directly the resistance to Badrang the Stoat there, whereas Martin goes off on this journey with Rose and Grum, where they decide they're going to go back to Rose's birthplace, the village of Noonvale, and see if they can build up an army along the way to try and free the slaves. So how does this translate to politics? Well, because of the way the characters are split up, we see different attitudes and strategies of resistance. So Feldo the squirrel, he hates Badrang with a passion. He is very explicit that his desire is to free the slaves and to kill Badrang and as much of his army as possible. Brome, by contrast, he has this vague hippie thing going on about him. His parents complain that he's always going wandering. And pretty quickly into the battle, he's like, I don't like killing. I'm going to become a pacifist. And this is a real innovation in the Redwall universe. One of my critiques of the first Redwall book is that they were too dismissive of pacifism. All the characters, whenever Abbot Mortimer tried to propose peace, they were like, you're dumb. These dumb rats are never going to give into peace. In Mariel of Redwall, we got Saxtus, who felt bad every time he killed someone and felt like a sort of early version of the character of Brome. But pretty much what happened with Saxtus is he'd feel bad and they'd say, it's normal that you feel this way, but this is a battle. You got to keep killing. And Saxtus is like, okay, I guess I'll go back to killing. Whereas Brome, I mean, there's some nuance to it, but he mostly stands by who he is. So I guess he represents a sort of Kingian version of resistance. He's the non-violent member of the struggle, but that doesn't mean he's not participating in the struggle. He finds his own ways to participate in the struggle. Whereas Feldo represents the sort of violent resistance at all costs element of the struggle. Some might say he also represents anarchist ideas of like direct action. You know, he's not waiting for a moment when the masses are all together and they can savvily win. He just wants to throw himself out into battle and, you know, express his moral indignation through his physical strength and through killing as much of the enemy as possible. Martin kind of represents a centrist figure between Brome and Feldo. Martin, in theory, is a warrior like Feldo, but he spends most of his story not literally going out and killing people. He doesn't do very much warring at all. He goes on this journey trying to build an army. You could say Martin represents the idea of not being a pacifist, about being okay with being militant, but being smart about it, realizing the most important thing is not going out and just going, yeah, freedom, but organizing, building up the cause in order to get there. In addition to these 3 versions of resistance, we have a supporting character named Droop, who is a bank vole. Bank voles have sort of been minor good characters in previous books, maybe a little bit shifty, but here Brian Jakes first really gets into the idea of the shifty bank vole. And I don't know much about voles per se, but I did learn that another name for them is water rats. So maybe Jakes decided they're sort of like mice, sort of like rats, so I'm going to have them be my good characters who aren't so good. But anyway, Droop is one of the slaves who decides to improve his own situation by selling information on the slave resistance to the slavers. And eventually he becomes so wedded to the cause of being the slave tattletale that he strokes the ire of Feldo. So the idea that some people in oppressive situations, they decide their only way out is to, you know, just buy into the logic of the oppressor, kind of like the character of Stephen in Django Unchained. So it's interesting that Brian Jakes brings that character into this book because we have not seen anything like that otherwise. So I feel like that's kind of the political element of Martin the Warrior, but you know, it's not a strictly political book. And I think another important thing to point out is that the difference between Martin and Feldo doesn't necessarily come down to philosophy. So I think an important plot structure, again, is that all 5 of these heroes are together at the beginning of the book, but then they get split up. So you could say if fate had happened slightly differently, if Feldo had been the one traveling with Rose and Grum and meeting all these interesting characters along the way, and Martin had been the one constantly in the throes of battle, perhaps Martin becomes the vengeful one who sees being a warrior as strictly about fighting war and becomes the same kind of morally gray figure that Feldo does. So there's an element of, yes, make the right decisions, but also life is a game of fate, there but for fortune. In a slightly different world, Martin never becomes the hero who founds Redwall Abbey and puts down his sword for peace because he's exposed to his triggering points on the same regular basis as Feldo ended up being. But something different happens to Martin because he is not in the throes of battle along with Feldo, because he is on this journey with Rose and Grum. What he does is he meets these various eccentric characters, these various wacky groups that are kind of superficially oppressive to him, but aren't portrayed as bad in the way the Stoats are. So you have this tribe of shrews, led by a queen named Mbala, who first take the characters as slaves, but then Martin wins them over. They're later also attacked by this group of squirrels called the Gaw tribe, who are kind of recklessly violent, but they call it all a game. What I kind of got from these characters was almost a Peter Pan vibe, like Martin and Rose are taking this temporary trek through Neverland. And I think what this represents is that part of becoming a warrior means you have to grow up, you have to mature, you have to have the knowledge of the world before you can handle serious battles and know when violence is appropriate and when it's not. Feldo, by contrast, had said he spent his whole literal childhood in slavery, and he also doesn't get this figurative growing up period that Martin gets through his travels through a sort of Neverland world. So this is also part of the development of a warrior. A final key difference between Martin and Feldo is their weapons. So Martin, as is famous throughout the series, has this special sword that it was revealed it was given to him by his father. And his father says, never give up your sword. Whereas Feldo just sort of fights with handmade javelins. And so this gift of the sword, it almost serves a spiritual function. Feldo is literally fighting to kill, whereas Martin is sort of killing indirectly through this magical talisman that is his sword. I wonder if this even has like a quasi-Christian thing to it because the sword is cross-shaped. I know Brian Jacques strove very hard to write secular books. He wasn't trying to be a C.S. Lewis, but just like he did with taking the concept of the Abbey and making it secular, it's almost like the sword of Martin is like this secular cross thing. So Martin is able to restrain his violent impulses by committing to being a warrior in an abstract spiritual way rather than thinking directly about the consequence of stabbing his sword into his enemies. So there's all kinds of cool going on with this book. And because of that, I feel like Brian Jacques has come a long way since the first few books, where one of my criticisms was it felt like all that mattered is whether the characters are good or whether they are bad. And if characters are good, they pretty much agree on everything. There's not ideological disputes or tactical disputes or philosophical disputes within the good side. That started to happen more in Salamandastron, and here we're really seeing the good characters. They aren't just a big clump of goodness like they were when they were traveling together in Madameo. Martin, Rose, Grum, Brome, Feldo, etc. They all bring their own thing to the plot. And beyond having these more obvious philosophical moral purposes, they also, react as real characters with one another. So one thing that really stands out to people about this book is the seeming romance between Martin and Rose. And what's fascinating about that for me is I did not pick up on that at all when I read this as an 8-year-old. And I'm not even sure how much I picked up on it when I read this as a 21-year-old. To be honest, it took me, I guess, talking to other fans and noticing the subtle little things. And I think that's great that Brian Jacques managed to write this romantic story where it's like subtle romantic intention. He doesn't spell it out for you that Rose is the damsel, right? She's this equal partner to Martin, and you have to figure out through their actual interactions that he has feelings for her. And there's this one scene late in the book where Rose's parents doesn't want Rose to show Martin to his bed, and that has to be innuendo, but I certainly did not pick up on that as a kid. So I've talked a lot about the heroes in this book, and there are some others. There's some funny side characters like the warden. He's this heron who's constantly saying, I am the law, I am the law. And then I haven't also talked about the actual bad guy of this book. So my first thought about the character of Badrang the Stoat is he's the first kind of boring bad guy in the series. I felt like with all the previous bad guys in the series, Brian Jacques found subtle ways to make them distinct as characters, and also their personality was shaped a bit by their species. So Sarmina, being a wildcat, was sort of this twisted but regal queen of the forest, or Slagar as a fox was a trickster, or Virago the weasel was this charming, sneaky assassin. Badrang, I barely picture him. He just felt like he was as literal as his name. He was bad. And also, it felt kind of random that he's a stoat. I guess Brian Jacques was saying stoats are one of the bad animals. I guess I'll have him be a stoat this time. But previously in the series, stoats have been portrayed as kind of dumb weasels. And so it felt kind of like with Badrang, he's like, okay, I've run out of ideas for unique bad guys. I just need some bad creature to fill the bad role. At the same time, what he did to make Badrang more interesting is he gives him a rival. So rather than having two separate villains with two separate plots, as had been done in lots of the previous books, whether we're talking Clooney and Asmodeus in the first book or Ray Patch and Gabool in the fourth book, here we have the two main villains interacting together and constantly bickering with each other and constantly trying to stab each other in the back while pretending and perhaps really seeing each other as old friends, perhaps even lovers. And the other villain in this book is Captain Traman Clog. And I talked in my review of the last book, Salamanderstron, how I found it weird that Brian Jacques hadn't picked up on the trope of the beloved villain sidekick, how he started to make some of his side villains likable, but then ultimately kind of dismissed them and killed them off the same way he dismissed and killed off other villains. He thinks, oh, kids just want all the bad guys to die. Traman Clog is a pretty dark figure, but he's a little bit funnier than Badrang. And Brian Jacques clearly writes him with some love. He was apparently Brian Jacques' favorite villain. And I also know that Treasure Island, along with Wind in the Willows, was a huge influence for young Brian Jacques. So maybe Traman Clog is his subtle way of bringing Long John Silver into the story. Long John Silver also being a character who's quite dark, but who you're still kind of inclined to like. The one thing that I think eventually comes out that he does with Badrang's personality, besides having be the straight man foil to Clog, is he plays up the idea that he's really a coward. There's this line at the beginning of the book about how all tyrants are really cowards at heart, though that line doesn't get applied to Badrang, it gets applied to one of his guards, Hisk. But towards the end of the book, when Badrang is fighting Martin, he actually starts to cry, he starts to blubber. And I don't know if Brian Jacques used that language to describe losing villains before. So maybe that's what makes Badrang uniquely a stoat. They're hardly the most menacing creature amongst the evil creatures in the Redwall universe. And so maybe what makes Badrang unique as a character is he tries to have this tough veneer. He tries to have his empire with his slaves, but he's kind of scared inside. Another subtle thing I noticed, going back to the idea of what a fierce killer Feldo in particular was for the good guys, there's this weird way in which the good characters engage in more extreme violence than the bad characters. And there's kind of a specific tactical reason for that. There's this one battle between the sides where one of Badrang's soldiers reports the losses back to him, and Badrang says, "You idiot, those are all our losses because those are our slaves. We don't want them killed. We want them to work for us." So another villain theme with this book is that there's an inherent arrogance to villainy, to tyranny, this assumption that you can just dominate people and that they will tolerate it rather than they will turn around and inflict your own violence back on you and maybe even kill you as a consequence. Sometimes the way in which villains just put heroes in their dungeons rather than killing them is a convenient plot device that allows the villain to seem sort of menacing while still keeping the hero alive. But I think towards the end of this book, and because of that particular incentive for Badrang to want to keep slaves, there's some truth to that message, this idea that in order to be a villain, in order to inflect power, you kind of have to have this naivete, this kind of naivety that keeps your enemies alive and keeps them coming back for more until they destroy you. So overall, I was very happy to read this book again. The major characters all had a real purpose. I thought maybe the beginning was a bit chaotic, but beyond that, certainly one of my favorite books in this reread. So hope to be back soon with my review of The Bellmaker, and see you next time.